Arizona Territory, spring of 1878. The dust hadn't even settled from the stagecoach wheels when Arabella Hartwell knew something was terribly wrong. She stood on the wooden platform of Prescott Station, her emerald traveling dress pristine despite the long journey from Boston, her auburn hair perfectly pinned beneath a feathered hat that had cost more than most frontier families earned in a month. The other passengers bustled past her, greeted by family members and business associates, but no one approached the elegant woman clutching a leather satchel and a carefully worded letter of introduction. Arabella's green eyes scanned the crowd hopefully, then with growing concern, and finally with the bitter recognition of abandonment she knew all too well. "Miss Hartwell?" A young man in a clerk's vest approached hesitantly, his face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm afraid I have a message for you from Mr. Thornton." Arabella's heart sank even before she heard the words. She had traveled over 2,000 miles to marry Gregory Thornton, a cattle rancher who had courted her through letters for 8 months, promising her a life of purpose and partnership in the growing Arizona Territory. Their correspondence had been filled with discussions of literature, philosophy, and dreams of building something meaningful together on the frontier. "Mr. Thornton sends his regrets, but he's decided to marry Miss Sarah Campbell instead. She arrived last week from California, and well," the clerk shifted uncomfortably, "he said to tell you that Miss Campbell is more suited to frontier life." The words hit Arabella like a physical blow, but she kept her spine straight and her voice steady. This was the third time. The third man who had courted her, made promises, and then decided she was somehow lacking. In Boston, it had been her inappropriate interest in business matters. In Denver, it had been her unfeminine education. Now, apparently, it was her unsuitability for frontier life, a judgment made without even meeting her. "I see," she said quietly, her Boston accent crisp in the desert air. "And am I to understand that Mr. Thornton has made no provision for my return journey?" The clerk's flush deepened. "Well, miss, he did say that a woman of your refinement would surely have family resources to draw upon." Arabella almost laughed at the bitter irony. If she had family resources, she wouldn't have been seeking marriage through correspondence with frontier ranchers. Her parents had died in a carriage accident 2 years prior, leaving her with debts that had consumed her inheritance. Her uncle had made it clear that she was welcome to remain in his household only as long as she made herself useful and unmarriageable as a governess to his children. "Thank you for delivering the message," she said with dignity that impressed even herself. "Good day." The clerk scurried away, leaving Arabella alone on the platform as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty town. She opened her reticule and counted the coins inside. Enough for perhaps a week at a modest boarding house, but not nearly enough for passage back east. Not that she particularly wanted to return to Boston and face the smug satisfaction of relatives who had predicted this outcome. Around her, the frontier town of Prescott buzzed with activity. Cowboys led their horses to the watering troughs, merchants hawked their wares from wooden storefronts, and women in practical calico dresses hurried about their business with a purposefulness that Arabella envied. These were women who belonged somewhere, who had roles to fill, and people who needed them. She picked up her single trunk, all her worldly possessions reduced to one leather-bound box, and began walking toward what appeared to be the town's main thoroughfare. The weight of curious stares followed her. Her eastern finery marked her as clearly foreign in this desert landscape, as if she had stepped off a ship from another continent. "Well, well, if it isn't the fancy lady from back east," a woman's voice called out, dripping with false sweetness. Arabella turned to see a blonde woman in a rose-colored dress approaching, flanked by 2 other women, whose expressions ranged from curiosity to outright hostility. "I'm Sarah Campbell," the blonde announced. "I suppose you've heard that I'm to be Mrs. Thornton." The casual cruelty in her tone made Arabella's hands clench, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Congratulations, Miss Campbell. I'm sure you'll be very happy together," Arabella replied. "Oh, we will be." Sarah's smile was sharp as a knife. Gregory said you seemed like a nice enough woman in your letters, but far too educated for a rancher's wife. He needs someone who understands a woman's proper place, not someone who thinks she can discuss business and politics like a man." The other women tittered, and Arabella felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. She had indeed written to Gregory about her interest in the cattle trade, her ideas for improving ranch efficiency, and her thoughts on territorial politics. She had thought he appreciated her mind. Apparently she had been wrong. "I hope your practical education serves you well," Arabella replied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "If you'll excuse me." She turned to walk away, but Sarah wasn't finished. "You know, Gregory showed me some of your letters. All those big words and fancy ideas. Did you really think any decent man would want a wife who acts like she's smarter than him?" The words followed Arabella down the dusty street like thrown stones. She had heard variations of this criticism her entire life, from her uncle, from suitors, from society matrons who believed that a woman's intelligence was inversely proportional to her marriageability. She had tried to temper herself, to hide her education and interests, but somehow her true nature always emerged. She found herself at the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to scrub brush and red rock formations that stretched toward distant mountains. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Instead, Arabella felt only the crushing weight of failure and the terrifying uncertainty of an unclear future. For the third time in her 26 years, she had been deemed unworthy of love and partnership. For the third time, a man had decided that her education, her opinions and her dreams made her unsuitable as a wife. The pattern was becoming painfully clear. She was, as her uncle had often reminded her, too much for most men to handle. She sat down on a fallen log and allowed herself, for the first time since receiving the clerk's message, to cry. Not the delicate tears of a proper lady, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from years of rejection and the growing certainty that she would never find a place where she belonged. The sound of approaching footsteps made her quickly wipe her eyes and attempt to compose herself. She looked up to see a Native American man approaching, tall, lean, with long black hair and wearing a mixture of traditional and white man's clothing. Her first instinct was fear. She had been raised on stories of savage Indians, but something in his dark eyes spoke of understanding rather than threat. He stopped a respectful distance away and spoke in accented but clear English. "Are you hurt?" His voice was gentle, concerned, and Arabella found herself answering honestly, "Not physically." He nodded, as if he understood the distinction. "I am called Hinto. Some call me by my white name, but I prefer the name my grandmother gave me." Arabella found herself responding automatically, "Arabella Hartwell." "I mean Miss Hartwell." His simple presence seemed to calm the storm in her chest. "You are far from home, Miss Hartwell," he observed without judgment. The simple statement somehow made her throat tighten with fresh tears. "Yes, I suppose I am, though I'm not entirely certain where home is anymore." Hinto tilted his head, studying her with eyes that seemed to see more than she was comfortable revealing. "You have the look of someone who has been told they do not belong." The accuracy of his observation startled her. "How could you possibly know that?" she asked. "Because I have seen that look in the mirror," he replied simply. "I am Apache, but I was raised in white schools. I'm educated, but my people sometimes see me as corrupted by white ways. I speak English better than many white men, but they see only my skin and call me savage. I belong fully to neither world." His words resonated in a way that surprised her. Here was someone who understood the pain of being caught between expectations, of never quite fitting the mold others had created. "Where do you live?" she asked, then immediately worried she was being inappropriate. "I have a small ranch north of here in the hills where few white settlers venture. I raise horses and cattle, trade with both Apache and white men, and try to find peace in the space between worlds. The idea of such solitude, of creating one's own space apart from society's judgments, appealed to Arabella more than she cared to admit. "That sounds wonderfully peaceful," she said. "It is lonely," Hinto admitted with an honesty that caught her off guard. "A person can only find so much peace in solitude before they begin to hunger for connection, for someone who understands their struggles." Their eyes met, and Arabella felt something pass between them, a recognition, perhaps, or a shared understanding of what it meant to be perpetually out of place. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked softly. "Because you are crying alone at the edge of town as the sun sets, and because something tells me you might understand what it means to be neither one thing nor another." Before Arabella could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. A group of cowboys rode up, led by a man she didn't recognize, but whose bearing suggested authority. Their faces were hard, suspicious, as they took in the scene of a white woman talking to an Apache man. "Evening, miss," the leader said, touching his hat but keeping his eyes on Hinto. "Is this savage bothering you?" Arabella felt anger flare at the casual slur, but before she could speak, Hinto rose smoothly to his feet, his posture respectful but not subservient. "Good evening, Sheriff Morrison. I was simply offering assistance to a lady in distress." The sheriff's voice carried a warning as he replied, "I wasn't talking to you, boy." "Miss, are you all right? Did he threaten you in any way?" The assumption that she couldn't possibly be willingly conversing with Hinto rankled her. "Mr. Hinto was being perfectly gentlemanly, Sheriff. More so than many white men I've encountered recently," she replied coolly. The sheriff's eyebrows rose at her defense of the Apache, and she saw him reassessing her, taking in her expensive clothes, her educated accent, her apparent lack of fear. "You're the Eastern lady who came for Thornton, aren't you? Heard he changed his mind about that arrangement." The casual mention of her humiliation made Arabella's cheeks burn, but she kept her voice level. "News travels quickly in a small town," she said. "It does indeed. Might want to be careful about the company you keep, Miss Hartwell. Folks around here don't take kindly to white women socializing with Indians, no matter how civilized they pretend to be." The threat was clear, and Arabella saw Hinto's jaw tighten, though he remained silent. The injustice of it, this good man being treated like a threat simply because of his heritage, stirred something fierce in her chest. "I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, but I'm quite capable of choosing my own company," she replied with steel in her voice. The sheriff's expression hardened. "Is that so? Well, Miss Hartwell, you might want to remember that you're not in Boston anymore. Out here we do things differently. Out here there are consequences for poor choices." The menace in his voice was unmistakable. Arabella felt a chill of real fear, but also a surge of defiant anger. Once again, she was being told what she could and couldn't do, who she could and couldn't associate with, based on other people's prejudices. "I'll keep that in mind," she said coolly. "Good evening, gentlemen." The sheriff touched his hat again, but his smile was cold. "Evening, Miss Hartwell. Hope you find suitable accommodations. You for the night." The men rode away, leaving Arabella and Hinto alone in the gathering darkness. The threat had been delivered, the boundaries made clear, associate with the Apache and face the consequences. "You should not have defended me," Hinto said quietly. "It will make things harder for you here," Arabella replied with a bitter laugh. "Things are already hard for me here. Apparently, I'm unsuitable for polite society, regardless of my choice of companions." Hinto studied her face in the dim light. "What will you do now? Where will you go?" The questions she had been avoiding all day crashed over her like a wave. She had no money, no prospects, no family to return to, and apparently no welcome in this town. She was stranded in a place where she understood neither the customs nor her own position. "I don't know," she admitted, the words feeling like a surrender. "I suppose I'll find a boarding house for tonight and figure out the rest tomorrow." Hinto spoke carefully. "There's only one boarding house in Prescott that would take an unaccompanied woman, and it is not a place where a lady like you should stay." The implication was clear, and Arabella felt a new wave of despair. She was caught between worlds, too refined for the rough accommodations available. Too poor for anything better, too unwelcome to impose on local families. Miss Hartwell, Hinto said slowly, as if weighing each word, I have a proposition that may sound improper, but I offer it with honest intentions. She looked at him, waiting. My ranch has a separate cabin that was built for someone who never came to live there. It is furnished, private, and safe. You would be welcome to stay there until you decide what you want to do next. The offer was both generous and dangerous. Accepting would mean confirming every prejudice the townspeople had about her character. Refusing might mean facing a night in unsavory accommodations or worse. Why would you help me? She asked. Because I know what it feels like to be caught between worlds, Hinto replied simply. Because I have been where you are now, alone, rejected, uncertain of the future. Someone helped me once, when I had nowhere else to turn. There was something in his voice, a depth of understanding that spoke to her soul. Here was a man who knew rejection, who understood what it meant to be deemed unsuitable by society's standards. If I accepted your offer, she said carefully, what would you expect in return? Hinto replied without hesitation, nothing. I would expect you to rest, to heal from whatever brought you to cry alone at the edge of town, and to take whatever time you need to decide your own path. The generosity of it was overwhelming. After a day of rejection and humiliation, here was someone offering kindness without conditions. The people in town would never understand, she said. The people in town have already decided what they think of both of us, Hinto replied. Their understanding was never truly possible anyway. Arabella looked back toward the lights of Prescott, where she would always be the rejected Eastern bride, too educated and opinionated for her own good. Then she looked at Hinto, this man who seemed to see her as a person rather than a problem to be solved or a reputation to be managed. All right, she said, the decision surprising her with its certainty. I accept your offer. Something shifted in Hinto's expression, relief, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit choosing trust over fear. My horse is nearby, he said. I can take you there tonight if you're ready. As they walked toward his horse, Arabella felt the strangest sensation, as if she was walking toward something rather than away from it. For the first time in years, she was making a choice based on her own instincts rather than society's expectations. The moon was rising over the Arizona desert, casting silver light on red rocks and endless sky. Behind them, the town of Prescott settled into its evening routines, secure in its judgments and expectations. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also possibility, the chance to discover who Arabella Hartwell might become when freed from the narrow definitions others had tried to impose upon her. The ride through the moonlit desert was unlike anything Arabella had ever experienced. Seated behind Hinto on his sturdy paint horse, she found herself surrounded by a landscape that seemed to exist outside of time itself. The red rocks glowed silver in the moonlight, and the vast expanse of star-filled sky stretched endlessly above them. The silence was profound, broken only by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional call of a night bird. Hinto guided his horse along paths that seemed invisible to Arabella's untrained eye, navigating by landmarks she couldn't perceive. His movements were fluid, natural, as if he and the horse were extensions of each other. She had expected to feel frightened, riding into unknown territory with a man she had just met. But instead she felt a strange sense of peace settling over her for the first time in months. How much further? She asked quietly, not wanting to break the spell of the desert night. Not far now, Hinto replied, his voice carrying easily in the still air. My land begins just beyond those rocks. He gestured toward a formation that looked like sleeping giants against the starlit sky. I chose this place because it sits between the Apache lands and the white settlements. Neither group claims it completely, which makes it perfect for someone who belongs to neither world fully. As they crested a small rise, Arabella gasped at the sight before them. Nestled in a natural hollow between towering red rocks was a collection of buildings that seemed to grow organically from the landscape itself. A main house built of adobe and timber sat at the center, its windows glowing with warm lamplight. To one side stood a smaller cabin, its architecture matching the main house, but clearly separate and private. Corrals held several horses, their coats gleaming in the moonlight, and beyond them she could see the shadowy shapes of cattle grazing in a natural meadow. "It's beautiful," she breathed, and meant it. The ranch had a sense of belonging to the land, rather than being imposed upon it, a harmony she had never seen in the more structured settlements of the East. "You built all of this yourself?" Hinto nodded as he dismounted and helped her down from the horse. "With help from both Apache and Mexican workers. It took 3 years to complete, but I wanted it to be right. This place, it needed to reflect all parts of who I am." He led her toward the smaller cabin, carrying her trunk with easy strength. "This was built for—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "for someone I once hoped would share this life with me. When that didn't happen, I thought perhaps it would serve as guest quarters or housing for workers. But it has stood empty for 2 years now." There was a story there, Arabella realized, another tale of disappointment and dashed hopes that paralleled her own. The cabin's interior was a revelation. Lean-lined furniture made from local wood filled the space, while colorful woven rugs covered the plank floors. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with wood already laid and ready to light. The bedroom held a bed covered in what appeared to be handmade quilts, and the small kitchen was stocked with basic supplies. Everything was simple but well crafted. Speaking of care and attention to detail, "This is far too generous," Arabella said, running her hand along the smooth surface of a wooden table. "I couldn't possibly—" Hinto held up a hand, stopping her protests. "Miss Hartwell, you would be doing me a kindness by staying here. This cabin has sat empty too long. It needs someone to bring it to life again." He moved to light the oil lamps, filling the space with warm, golden light. "Besides, I suspect you need time to think, to decide what you want your future to look like without the pressure of immediate decisions." As the cabin came alive with light and warmth, Arabella felt something inside her chest begin to unknot. For the first time since leaving Boston, she was in a space that felt safe, where she wasn't being judged or measured against impossible standards. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked. "You don't even know me." Hinto paused in his lighting of the lamps, considering her question seriously. "I know enough," he said finally. "I know you defended me to the sheriff when it would have been easier to stay silent. I know you've been hurt by people who should have valued you. I know you have courage, or you wouldn't have traveled across the country to start a new life." He faced her fully, his dark eyes serious. "And I know what it feels like to be alone in a world that seems determined to reject everything you are." The honesty in his voice touched something deep in Arabella's heart. Here was a man who understood rejection not as an abstract concept, but as a lived experience. "What happened?" she asked gently. "With the person this cabin was built for?" Hinto's expression grew distant, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit landscape. "Her name was Catherine. She was a teacher at the Indian school where I was educated. A white woman who believed in the possibility of 2 worlds coming together in harmony." His voice carried old pain, carefully controlled. "We corresponded for months after I left the school. She wrote of her desire to come west to continue teaching, to build something meaningful with someone who understood both worlds." Arabella felt her heart clench with recognition, how similar their stories were. "She accepted my proposal of marriage, helped me plan this ranch, even suggested improvements to the cabin design through her letters." Hinto's hands gripped the window frame. "When the time came for her to join me, her family intervened. They couldn't allow their daughter to marry a savage, even an educated one. The engagement was broken by telegram. The casual cruelty of it took Arabella's breath away. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. I learned that day that love, no matter how genuine, is not always stronger than fear, Hinto continued. Catherine chose her family's approval over our shared dreams. I cannot entirely blame her. The price of defying such expectations is high. He turned back to Arabella, his expression clearing. But that was 2 years ago. This cabin has been waiting for someone who might appreciate it, and perhaps you are that someone. Arabella looked around the carefully prepared space with new eyes, seeing now the love and hope that had gone into its creation. It must have been painful preparing all of this, and then she let the sentence hang, unable to finish it. It was, Hinto acknowledged, but pain can be transformed into something useful if we allow it. This cabin, built for love that never came to fruition, can now offer sanctuary to someone who needs it. There is poetry in that, I think. The philosophical way he spoke reminded Arabella of her own tendency toward introspection, another trait that had been deemed unsuitable in a proper wife. You think deeply about things, she observed. Another gift from my education that makes me suspect to both worlds, Hinto replied with a rueful smile. Apache warriors are not supposed to quote poetry. White men don't trust an Indian who thinks too much. He moved toward the door. I'll leave you to rest now. Tomorrow, if you wish, I can show you more of the ranch. Hinto, she called as he reached the door. He turned back. Thank you. For this kindness, for this refuge. I know it can't be easy, taking in a stranger who brings her own troubles with her. He studied her face for a long moment. Miss Hartwell, I don't think you bring troubles. I think you bring possibilities. The question is whether you'll allow yourself to see them. With that, he stepped into the night, leaving her alone with thoughts that churned like desert wind. Arabella spent her first night in the cabin tossing restlessly, her mind replaying the events of the day. The rejection by Thornton, the cruel words from Sarah Campbell, the threatening presence of the sheriff, and finally this unexpected sanctuary offered by a man who understood rejection as intimately as she did. The contrast between the day's beginning and its end seemed impossible to reconcile. When dawn broke over the red rocks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Arabella rose and dressed in her simplest traveling dress. Through the cabin window, she could see Hinto already at work in the corrals, moving among his horses with the same fluid grace she had observed the night before. The sight of him stirred something in her chest. Not the desperate gratitude of a rescued woman, but something deeper and more complex. She prepared a simple breakfast from the supplies in the cabin's kitchen, surprised to find how much she enjoyed the basic tasks of cooking and tending for herself. In Boston, such work had been done by servants. In her uncle's house, she had been expected to supervise but not participate. Here, for the first time, she was free to care for herself as she saw fit. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Hinto standing there with a steaming cup in his hands. "Coffee," he said simply. "I thought you might appreciate it." The gesture was small but thoughtful, and it touched her more than grand romantic displays ever had. "Thank you," she said, accepting the cup and inhaling the rich aroma. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. "Eventually," she admitted. "I spent much of the night thinking." Hinto nodded as if he understood. "New places can stir up old thoughts. Would you like to see the rest of the ranch this morning? Sometimes activity helps settle a restless mind." Arabella found herself nodding. The prospect of exploring this unique place, of understanding how Hinto had built his life between worlds, appealed to her greatly. They spent the morning touring the ranch, and Arabella was impressed by the ingenuity and thoughtfulness evident everywhere. The main house combined Apache and Mexican architectural elements with practical American frontier features. The corrals were designed to work with the natural landscape rather than against it. The vegetable garden used indigenous plants alongside traditional crops, creating a sustainable system that required minimal water in the desert environment. You've created something remarkable here. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Arabella said, as they paused beside a natural spring that provided water for the entire operation. "It's unlike anything I've ever seen," Hinto smiled, and she noticed how the expression transformed his usually serious face. "It took time to figure out how to make it work. I had to learn from Apache elders, Mexican vaqueros, and white ranchers. Each group had knowledge the others lacked, but they were willing to teach you?" Arabella asked, remembering the hostility she had witnessed in town. "Some were," Hinto replied carefully. "Others required persuasion. I had to prove myself worthy of their knowledge. Success has a way of overcoming prejudice, at least in practical matters." He gestured toward a group of cattle, grazing peacefully in the distance. "These animals don't care about the color of their owner's skin or the source of his education. They care about good grass and clean water." As they walked back toward the main house, Arabella found herself asking questions about everything. The breeds of horses he raised, the techniques he used for water conservation, the challenges of trading with multiple communities. Hinto answered thoughtfully, clearly pleased by her genuine interest. It had been so long since anyone had valued her curiosity rather than finding it inappropriate. "You have a good mind for ranch management," he observed as they reached the main house. "Have you given thought to what you might want to do with your life, now that your original plans have changed?" The question was gentle but pointed, and Arabella realized she had been avoiding thinking about her future beyond the immediate crisis. "I don't know," she admitted. "In Boston, my options were limited to teaching if I could find a position, or remaining as my uncle's unpaid governess. Marriage seemed like the only way to build a life of my own choosing." She paused, looking out over the peaceful ranch. "But perhaps there are other possibilities I hadn't considered, such as—" Hinto prompted. Arabella felt a flutter of excitement as ideas began to form. "Well, there's clearly a need for education in this territory. Not just for children, but for adults who want to learn new skills, new languages, and medical knowledge. I studied some nursing before my parents died. There might be ways to serve communities that need help." Hinto's eyes lit up with interest. "There are several Apache bands in the area who would benefit from someone who could teach English and basic medicine. And the Mexican families who work the smaller ranches often need help with legal documents and correspondence." He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "If you were interested in such work, I could help you make connections." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Hinto's expression immediately grew guarded as he recognized the riders, Sheriff Morrison and 2 deputies, the same men who had confronted them the previous evening. Arabella felt her stomach clench with apprehension as the men dismounted and approached. "Morning, Hinto," the sheriff said, his tone deceptively casual. "Thought we'd ride out and check on your guest, make sure everything's proper out here." His eyes swept over Arabella, taking in her simple dress and the fact that she appeared comfortable and unharmed. "Miss Hartwell, you're looking well this morning." The implication in his tone made Arabella's cheeks burn. "Sheriff Morrison," she replied coolly, "I'm quite well. Thank you. Mr. Hinto has been a perfect gentleman." One of the deputies snorted softly, and Arabella saw Hinto's hands clench at his sides. The casual disrespect was like a slap in the face, and she felt her temper rising. "Is there something you need, Sheriff?" she asked. "Just making sure everything's above board," Morrison replied. "Wouldn't want any misunderstandings about the nature of your arrangement here." The threat was barely veiled, and Arabella felt her resolve harden. She had spent her entire adult life being told what was proper, what was acceptable, what was suitable for a lady. She was tired of allowing other people's narrow minds to dictate her choices. "The nature of my arrangement," she said clearly, "is that Mr. Hinto has offered me temporary shelter while I decide my future plans. He has been nothing but respectful and kind, which is more than I can say for some of the treatment I've received from so-called civilized society." The sheriff's eyes narrowed at her pointed words. "Miss Hartwell, you might want to be careful about the company you keep and the choices you make," Morrison said, his voice carrying a clear warning. This territory can be dangerous for those who don't understand how things work. Hinto stepped forward slightly, placing himself partially between Arabella and the sheriff. "The lady is under my protection," he said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. "Is that so?" Morrison's hand moved casually to rest on his gun butt. "And what exactly does that mean, Hinto?" The tension in the air was thick enough to cut, and Arabella realized they were balanced on the edge of violence. The thought that Hinto might be hurt because of her made her stomach churn with fear and guilt. "It means," she said, stepping forward to stand beside Hinto, "that I have found a friend in a place where I expected only hostility. It means that someone saw fit to offer kindness to a stranger without expecting anything in return. If that's threatening to you, Sheriff, perhaps you should examine your own conscience." The words rang with conviction, and she saw surprise flicker in Morrison's eyes. The sheriff studied both of them for a long moment, clearly calculating his next move. Finally, he touched his hat brim in a gesture that was more mocking than respectful. "Well then, I suppose there's nothing more to be said today. But Miss Hartwell, I hope you'll remember what I told you about consequences. They have a way of finding people, even out here." After the men rode away, leaving dust and tension in their wake, Arabella and Hinto stood in silence for several moments. Finally, Hinto turned to her, his expression serious. "You shouldn't have challenged him," he said quietly. "Morrison is a dangerous man with dangerous friends. You've made yourself a target." Arabella lifted her chin defiantly. "I was already a target the moment I chose to associate with you," she replied. "At least now it's for something worthwhile, defending a good man against prejudice and hatred." Hinto stared at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his dark eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition, or something deeper that made her heart skip a beat. "You continue to surprise me, Arabella Hartwell," he said softly, using her first name for the first time. The sound of it on his lips sent warmth spreading through her chest. Most people, when faced with the choice between safety and principle, choose safety. She met his gaze steadily, feeling as if she was standing at the edge of something vast and unknown. "Perhaps I've spent too many years choosing safety over principle," she replied. "Perhaps it's time I discovered who I might become when I stopped trying to be who others expect me to be." The words hung between them like a promise or a challenge, and Arabella felt the last of her old certainties crumbling away, replaced by something both terrifying and exhilarating. As the sun climbed higher over the red rocks of Arizona, casting everything in golden light, Arabella realized that she was no longer the same woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Prescott just 24 hours earlier. That woman had been defined by her rejections, shaped by others' expectations, limited by society's narrow definitions of what she could be. This woman, standing in the desert beside a man who understood what it meant to live between worlds, felt the stirring of possibilities she had never dared imagine. 3 weeks had passed since Arabella's arrival at the ranch, and she had fallen into a rhythm of life unlike anything she had ever experienced. Each morning, she rose with the sun and helped Hinto tend to the horses, her soft eastern hands gradually developing calluses from real work. In the afternoons, she explored the vast library in his main house, discovering books in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Apache, that revealed the depth of his education and the breadth of his interests. On this particular morning, Arabella stood in the natural amphitheater behind the ranch house, facing a small group of Apache children and their mothers. She had begun teaching English lessons twice a week, using a combination of traditional methods and the practical approach Hinto had suggested. The children were bright and eager, and their mothers had gradually warmed to the strange white woman who treated them with genuine respect. "Very good, Maria," Arabella praised, as a young girl successfully pronounced a difficult English phrase. "Now, can you tell me what you did this morning using the new words we learned?" The child's face lit up with pride as she carefully constructed a sentence about helping her grandmother prepare corn for winter storage. Arabella had discovered that learning came more easily when it connected to the students' real experiences, rather than abstract concepts from Eastern textbooks. From the shade of a large cottonwood tree, Hinto watched the lesson with an expression of quiet satisfaction. He had been skeptical when Arabella first proposed the classes, worried that her Eastern education might not translate well to Apache learning styles. But she had surprised him with her adaptability and her genuine respect for Apache culture. She asked questions about their traditions, incorporated their values into her lessons, and never spoke down to either the children or their mothers. "Teacher lady," called out a boy of perhaps 8 years, using the Apache name the children had given her. "Why do white people have so many words for the same thing?" Arabella smiled at the question, which had come up several times. "That's a wonderful question, Joseph. Different people develop language based on what's important to them. Apache has many words for different types of weather and land because those things are central to Apache life. English has many words for business and legal concepts because those things are important in white culture." An older woman, Grey Dove, spoke up in Apache, and one of the children translated. "My grandmother wants to know if you think Apache ways are better or white ways are better." The question was loaded with significance, and Arabella could feel the weight of expectation in the air. How she answered would determine whether these people would continue to trust her. "Tell your grandmother," Arabella said carefully, "that I believe every culture has wisdom to offer, and the wisest people are those who can learn from many different ways of seeing the world. I have learned more in these 3 weeks from Apache knowledge than in years of Eastern schooling." Grey Dove listened to the translation, then nodded approvingly and spoke again. The child grinned as she translated, "Grandmother says you have the heart of a learner, not a teacher who thinks she knows everything." After the lesson ended and the families departed, Arabella found herself walking with Hinto toward the spring that supplied water to the ranch. The late afternoon light painted the red rocks in shades of amber and gold, and the air carried the scent of sage and wild grass. These walks had become a daily ritual, a time when they shared thoughts about the day and gradually revealed more of themselves to each other. "The children are progressing remarkably well," Hinto observed. "But I think you are learning as much from them as they are from you." Arabella laughed, a sound that had become more frequent and genuine during her time at the ranch. "More, probably. I'm beginning to understand that my education, for all its supposed refinement, left out some of the most important lessons about how to actually live in the world." "Such as?" Hinto prompted, settling beside her on a flat rock overlooking the valley. This had become their favorite spot for conversation, a place where the concerns of both Apache and white worlds seemed distant and unimportant. "Such as the value of practical skills over theoretical knowledge," Arabella replied. "The importance of understanding the land you live on rather than trying to impose your will upon it. The wisdom of listening more than speaking." Hinto was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "Those are hard lessons for someone raised in your world to learn. The white education system is built on the idea that knowledge comes from books and authority figures, not from observation and experience." His voice carried a note of old pain, and Arabella realized he was speaking from personal experience of trying to navigate between educational philosophies. "Tell me about your time in the white schools," she said gently. "What was it like to be the only Apache student?" Hinto's expression grew distant, and she saw him wrestling with memories he rarely shared. "Lonely," he said finally, "and confusing. The teachers wanted me to succeed, to prove that Indians could be civilized, but they also wanted me to abandon everything that made me Apache. I was supposed to become white in all but skin color, but you didn't abandon your Apache identity," Arabella observed. "How did you manage to keep both?" Hinto smiled ruefully. "It wasn't easy. I learned to be two different people. Apache when I was home with my family, white when I was at school. I spoke different languages, wore different clothes, followed different customs, depending on where I was. For a long time, I thought that was the only way to survive. What changed? Arabella asked, genuinely curious about how he had found the strength to integrate both sides of his identity. Time, Hinto replied, and the realization that trying to be two separate people was tearing me apart. I had to find a way to be fully myself in both worlds, even if neither world was entirely comfortable with that choice. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a horse approaching at speed. Hinto immediately rose, his posture alert, and Arabella felt tension creep into the peaceful evening. A young Apache man rode into view, his horse lathered with sweat and his face tight with urgency. He called out in rapid Apache, and Arabella watched Hinto's expression grow grave as he listened. "What is it?" she asked as the messenger finished speaking and rode away toward the Apache camps. Hinto's jaw was tight with anger and concern. "There's been trouble in town. Sheriff Morrison arrested 2 Apache men for allegedly stealing cattle. But the men were here, helping me repair fences, at the time the theft supposedly occurred. Morrison knows this, but he arrested them anyway." Arabella felt cold dread settle in her stomach. "What will happen to them?" Hinto's expression was grim. "If they're convicted, they'll hang. Morrison has been looking for an excuse to make an example of Apache men, to show that the law favors white settlers. These men are convenient scapegoats." He turned toward the house, his movements quick and decisive. "I have to go to town, provide testimony about their whereabouts. I'm coming with you," Arabella said immediately. Hinto shook his head. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. Morrison already suspects you of inappropriate behavior by staying here. If you testify on behalf of Apache men, you'll be branded as an Indian sympathizer. The consequences could be severe. The consequences of letting innocent men hang would be worse," Arabella replied firmly. "I was here when they were working on the fences. I saw them with my own eyes. My testimony could help save their lives." Hinto stared at her, clearly torn between admiration for her courage and fear for her safety. "Arabella, you don't understand what you're risking. If you testify for Apache men against the word of white settlers, you'll be labeled a traitor to your own race." "Then so be it," she said with a conviction that surprised them both. "I've spent my entire life trying to be what other people wanted me to be, trying to fit into their narrow definitions of propriety and respectability. Look where it got me, rejected by 3 different men who found me unsuitable for their purposes." She met his eyes steadily. "If being suitable means staying silent while innocent people suffer, then I choose to be unsuitable." The ride to town was tense and silent, both of them lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. As they approached Prescott, Arabella could see crowds gathering around the jail, and the mood seemed ugly and volatile. News of the arrests had spread quickly, and it was clear that many townspeople were eager for Apache blood. Regardless of guilt or innocence, they dismounted near the courthouse, and immediately Arabella became aware of hostile stares and whispered comments. Her association with Hinto had been noted and remembered, and her presence here was clearly seen as confirmation of her inappropriate loyalties. She lifted her chin and walked beside Hinto with as much dignity as she could muster. Inside the courthouse, chaos reigned. Sheriff Morrison was holding court in the absence of the circuit judge, clearly intending to dispense his own version of justice before any inconvenient legal procedures could interfere. The 2 accused men sat in shackles, their faces stoic but their eyes showing the strain of their situation. Well, Morrison said as he spotted Hinto and Arabella entering, "if it isn't our local Indian lover and his white woman. Come to lie for your red friends, have you?" The crowd murmured angrily at his words, and Arabella felt the weight of their hostility like a physical force. Several men moved to block the exits, making it clear that leaving might not be as simple as walking out. "Sheriff Morrison," Hinto said formally, "I'm here to provide testimony regarding the whereabouts of these men at the time of the alleged theft. They were working on my ranch, in my direct supervision, when the crime supposedly took place." Morrison's smile was cold and predatory. "Is that so?" And I suppose you have witnesses to corroborate this convenient alibi." His tone made it clear he didn't expect any white person to step forward. "I do," Arabella said, her voice carrying clearly through the crowded room. "I witnessed both men working on fence repairs from sunrise to sunset on the day in question. They never left the ranch property." A shocked silence fell over the courthouse as the implications of her statement sank in. A white woman of evident refinement was publicly supporting Apache men against white accusers. "Miss Hartwell," Morrison said, his voice deceptively gentle, "are you certain you want to make such a statement?" "Under oath, knowing that false testimony is a serious crime." The threat was clear: support the Apache men and face criminal charges herself. Arabella felt her heart pounding, but kept her voice steady. "I am prepared to swear under oath to the truth of my statement," she replied. "These men are innocent of the charges against them, and I will not stand by and watch innocent people be punished for crimes they did not commit." The crowd erupted in angry shouts, and several men moved closer, their intentions clearly hostile. "Order!" Morrison shouted, though he looked pleased by the crowd's reaction. "Miss Hartwell, you realize that your association with Indians calls your credibility into serious question. A woman who would live unchaperoned among savages clearly lacks the moral judgment necessary for reliable testimony." The personal attack made Arabella's cheeks burn, but she refused to back down. "My living arrangements are irrelevant to my ability to observe and report facts," she replied coolly. "I saw what I saw, and no amount of character assassination will change the truth." She looked directly at Morrison, letting her contempt show clearly. "Unless, of course, the truth is inconvenient for whatever narrative you're trying to construct." The tension in the room was becoming dangerous, and Arabella could see several men fingering weapons. Hinto moved closer to her, clearly preparing to defend her if violence broke out. But before the situation could explode, a new voice cut through the chaos. "That's enough." The crowd parted to reveal an elderly man in a black coat and clerical collar, Father Miguel Santos, the Catholic priest who served both Mexican and Apache communities in the region. His presence immediately commanded respect, even from those who might disagree with his progressive views. "Sheriff Morrison, these proceedings are a mockery of justice." "Father Santos," Morrison said, his tone becoming more respectful despite his obvious annoyance. "This is a legal matter, not a religious one." The priest's eyes blazed with righteous anger. When innocent men are being railroaded because of their race, it becomes very much a religious matter. "I also saw these men at Senor Hinto's ranch on the day in question. I was there to bless his new well." The priest's testimony carried weight that even Morrison couldn't easily dismiss. Father Santos was respected by all communities, white and Mexican alike, and his reputation for honesty was unquestioned. The crowd's mood began to shift, uncertainty replacing angry certainty. "Furthermore," the priest continued, his voice ringing with authority, "I have spoken with the actual owners of the allegedly stolen cattle. They have found their animals in a remote canyon, apparently driven there by a mountain lion. No theft occurred at all." The revelation hit the courthouse like a thunderbolt. Morrison's carefully constructed case was crumbling before his eyes. In the confusion that followed, Arabella found herself separated from Hinto as the crowd surged toward the exits. The two Apache men were released amid grudging apologies, but the mood remained ugly. Several townspeople shot dark looks at Arabella, clearly holding her responsible for embarrassing them by supporting the wrong side. Outside the courthouse, she was confronted by Sarah Campbell and several other women from the town's social elite. "Well, Miss Hartwell," Sarah said with vicious satisfaction, "I hope you're pleased with yourself. You've made it quite clear where your loyalties lie." The other women murmured agreement, their faces cold with disapproval. "My loyalty," Arabella replied with dignity, "lies with truth and justice, regardless of the race of those involved. I would think any Christian woman would understand that." Sarah's face flushed with anger at the implied criticism. "Don't you dare lecture us about Christian duty, you shameless woman." Everyone knows what you're doing out there with that savage." Before Arabella could respond to the vile accusation, Hinto appeared at her side. His presence immediately silenced the women, though their hostile stares remained. "Miss Hartwell," he said formally, "we should return to the ranch now." As they walked toward their horses, Arabella could feel the weight of hostile stares following them. She had made her choice publicly and irrevocably. She had chosen truth over acceptance, justice over safety. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them processing what had occurred and its implications. As they crested the rise that revealed the peaceful valley where Hinto had built his life between worlds, Arabella felt a strange sense of coming home. The hostility of the town seemed distant and unimportant compared to the peace and purpose she had found here. "You realize what you've done today?" Hinto asked as they dismounted near the cabin. "You've burned every bridge back to white society. There's no returning to respectability after publicly supporting Apache men against white accusers." His voice carried concern rather than gratitude. Worry for what she had sacrificed on behalf of people who were strangers to her. "Good," Arabella said with surprising vehemence. "If respectability means staying silent while innocent people suffer, if it means choosing comfortable lies over difficult truths, then I want no part of it." She looked around at the ranch, at the life Hinto had built through courage and determination. "I'd rather be unsuitable among people who value justice than suitable among people who value only the color of their neighbor's skin." As the sun set behind the red rocks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Arabella felt the last of her old life falling away like a discarded garment. She was no longer the proper Boston lady seeking marriage as a means of social advancement. She was no longer the rejected bride defined by others' opinions of her worth. She was becoming someone new, someone who chose her own values and lived by them, regardless of the cost. Hinto watched her face in the fading light, seeing something there that made his breath catch. This woman who had arrived broken and rejected was transforming into someone strong and purposeful. Someone who could stand beside him in the space between worlds, rather than hiding behind the safety of conventional choices. For the first time since Catherine's rejection, he allowed himself to hope that perhaps he had found someone who could truly understand the life he had chosen to build. The drought had lasted 6 weeks, longer than anyone in the territory could remember. The usually reliable spring that fed Hinto's ranch had dwindled to a trickle, and the grass in the pastures had turned brittle and yellow under the relentless Arizona sun. Arabella stood on the porch of her cabin in the pre-dawn darkness, watching orange flames dance along the distant ridgeline where a lightning strike had ignited the dry timber the night before. "It's moving this way," Hinto said quietly, appearing beside her with 2 cups of coffee. His face was grim as he studied the fire's progress through the darkness. "The wind is pushing it toward the valley. If it jumps the creek bed, it could reach the ranch by midday." Arabella felt her stomach clench with fear, not just for the buildings and animals, but for the life she had begun to build here, in this sanctuary between worlds. Over the past month since the courthouse incident, her relationship with Hinto had deepened into something neither of them had dared to name. They worked side by side during the day, shared meals and conversations in the evening, and gradually revealed the deepest parts of themselves to each other. Arabella had never felt so understood, so valued for who she truly was, rather than who others expected her to be. "What can we do?" she asked, watching the flames creep closer with hypnotic fascination. "The horses and cattle, we have to get them to safety." Hinto nodded, already moving toward the corrals. "I'll start moving the livestock toward the southern canyon where the creek is wider. The fire shouldn't be able to cross there." "But Arabella..." He paused, his dark eyes serious in the firelight. "I need you to take what you value most and head to town. This could get dangerous." "I'm not leaving," she said immediately, the words surprising her with their vehemence. "This is my home now, too. I won't abandon it at the first sign of trouble." Hinto's expression softened at her use of the word home, but his voice remained firm. "This isn't your fight. You have a chance to return to safety, to respectability. Morrison would welcome you back if you came to town now, if you showed proper remorse for your association with me." The suggestion hit Arabella like a physical blow. After everything they had shared, everything she had learned about herself and about him, did he still think she would choose safety over loyalty? "Is that what you want?" she asked, her voice tight with hurt. "Do you want me to go running back to people who see me as nothing more than a fallen woman to be pitied or condemned?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Hinto's face showed his own pain at her words. "I want you to live," he said simply. "I want you to have the chance at the life you deserve, not to die in a fire defending a place that was never meant to be permanent for you." His words revealed his own deep fear, that despite everything, she would eventually leave him for the safer, more conventional life she had been raised to expect. "Hinto," she said, stepping closer and taking his hands in hers. "Look at me. Really look at me." Her voice was steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Do you see a woman who wants safety more than meaning? Do you see someone who would abandon the first place she's ever felt truly at home?" His eyes searched her face, looking for doubt or hesitation, and finding only fierce determination. Before he could answer, the sound of galloping horses interrupted them. 3 Apache riders approached at speed, their faces painted for war and their weapons clearly visible. Arabella felt a moment of instinctive fear before recognizing one of them as Tom Crow Feather, an elder who had become a regular participant in her English lessons. Tom spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing toward the advancing fire and then toward the town. Hinto's expression grew increasingly grave as he listened, and Arabella wished desperately that she understood more of the language. When Tom finished speaking, Hinto turned to her with a new urgency in his manner. "The fire was set deliberately," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Tom's scouts found evidence of multiple ignition points, traces of kerosene, boot prints leading back toward town. "Someone wanted to burn us out." Arabella felt cold shock wash over her, despite the growing heat from the approaching flames. Who would do such a thing? But even as she asked, she suspected she knew the answer. "Morrison and his allies," Hinto confirmed grimly. "They've decided that legal harassment isn't working fast enough. If they can't drive me out through the courts, they'll use fire." Tom spoke again, and Hinto nodded. "He says there are armed men positioned between here and town, waiting to make sure no one escapes the fire. They plan to claim it was an accident, a tragedy of the drought." The full horror of the situation crashed over Arabella like a wave. This wasn't just about destroying property, it was attempted murder, carefully planned and executed by men who hid their hatred behind badges and respectability. "We have to get word to Father Santos, to someone who can stop this," she said desperately. "There's no time," Hinto replied, already moving toward the corrals where the horses were becoming increasingly agitated by the smell of smoke. "Our only chance is to save what we can and survive until help arrives." Tom and the other Apache riders began working with practiced efficiency, cutting out the most valuable horses and driving them toward the canyon route. Arabella found herself caught up in the desperate rhythm of evacuation, her Eastern education proving useless as she struggled to help move frightened animals away from the advancing flames. The fire had grown enormous, feeding on 6 weeks of drought-dried vegetation and pushed by desert winds that seemed to grow stronger by the hour. "The main house," she shouted over the roar of wind and flame. "Your books, your papers, there are irreplaceable things in there." Hinto paused in his work with the cattle, torn between practical necessity and the loss of a lifetime's accumulation of knowledge and memory. "There's no time," he said, but she could see the pain in his eyes at the thought of losing everything he had built. Without thinking, Arabella ran toward the main house, ignoring Hinto's shouts of protest. Inside, she grabbed an empty grain sack and began stuffing it with the most important items she could find: family photographs, legal documents, the journals where Hinto recorded his observations about ranching in the desert. The heat was becoming overwhelming, and smoke was beginning to seep through the walls. As she emerged from the house, her sack heavy with rescued treasures, she saw that the situation had become even more desperate. The fire had jumped the creek in 2 places and was now advancing on multiple fronts. Worse, she could see armed men silhouetted against the flames, clearly positioned to prevent any escape toward town. "This way," Tom Crowfeather called out in English, gesturing toward a narrow canyon that led deeper into Apache territory. "Safe path through the rocks." But even as he spoke, Arabella could see that the route was treacherous, suitable for experienced riders, but potentially deadly for someone of her limited skills. "I can't make that ride," she admitted to Hinto, hating the confession but knowing it was true. "I'll slow everyone down and get us all killed." The pragmatic part of her mind understood that staying behind would mean certain death, but the thought of causing others to die because of her limitations was unbearable. Hinto's face showed his own internal struggle. Staying to help her escape meant abandoning the animals he had spent years building up, his life's work disappearing in flames. Leaving her behind meant sacrificing the woman he had come to love for the sake of property that could eventually be replaced. The choice was impossible, but the approaching flames allowed no time for lengthy consideration. "There's another way," he said suddenly, his voice carrying a new determination. "The old mine shaft in the eastern canyon. It goes deep enough into the rock to protect us from the fire, and it has a back entrance that opens onto Apache lands." Tom shook his head vigorously, speaking rapidly in Apache, clearly objecting to the plan. "What is he saying?" Arabella asked, though she suspected from Tom's expression that the plan involved significant danger. "He says the mine is unstable, that white men abandoned it for good reason. He's right, there have been cave-ins, and the air inside may not be breathable." Hinto's jaw tightened with resolve. "But it's our best chance to survive long enough for help to arrive." The decision was made for them as flames crested the ridge directly above the ranch buildings. The heat became suddenly intense, and embers began raining down like fiery snow. There was no more time for debate or consideration of alternatives. They had to move now, or die where they stood. Hinto boosted Arabella onto his strongest horse and swung up behind her, his arms encircling her as he took the reins. Tom and the other Apache riders flanked them as they raced toward the eastern canyon, the fire pursuing them like a living thing hungry for their destruction. The smoke was so thick now that breathing became a conscious effort, and the heat seemed to suck the moisture from their bodies. The entrance to the mine shaft appeared through the smoke like a black mouth in the red rock face. They dismounted quickly, leading the horses as far into the tunnel as possible before the ceiling became too low. The air inside was cooler but stale, carrying the musty smell of long abandonment and the metallic tang of old ore. "How deep does this go?" Arabella asked, trying to keep the fear out of her voice as they moved deeper into the darkness. Hinto had produced a torch from his saddlebags, its flickering light revealing rough-hewn walls and timber supports that looked disturbingly fragile. "Deep enough, I hope," he replied grimly. "The question is whether the air will last and whether the fire will burn itself out before we're forced to come back up." They settled into a wider chamber, about 200 feet into the mountain, the horses nickering nervously at the strange environment. Tom distributed water from their canteens with careful precision, making it clear that conservation would be essential for survival. The sound of the fire above them was muffled but still audible, a constant roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. Hours passed in the smoky darkness, marked only by the gradual dimming of their torch and the increasing stuffiness of the air. Arabella found herself pressed against Hinto's side, drawing comfort from his steady presence as the reality of their situation sank in. They might die here, buried alive in an abandoned mine, while their enemies celebrated above. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the distant rumble of flame and collapsing timber. "I'm sorry you lost everything because of me." Hinto's arm tightened around her shoulders. "You think this is your fault?" His voice carried genuine surprise. "Arabella, these men would have found an excuse to attack me whether you were here or not. Your presence didn't create their hatred, it just gave them a convenient target. But if I had gone back to town when you suggested it, if I had shown proper remorse and distance from you, maybe they would have been satisfied with humiliating me and left you alone." She persisted, the guilt eating at her like acid. "Maybe you could have kept your ranch, your life's work." "Listen to me," Hinto said, turning to face her in the flickering torchlight. "If you had gone back to town, if you had abandoned me to save your reputation, I would have understood, but I would never have forgiven myself for asking you to compromise your principles for my safety." His hands cupped her face gently. "You stayed because you are brave and loyal and true to your convictions. Those are not qualities to apologize for." Tom spoke quietly in Apache, and Hinto nodded gravely before translating. "He says the smoke is clearing above us. Either the fire has passed or—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Either the fire had moved on, or there was nothing left to burn, and they were trapped in a tomb of their own making. The decision to risk emergence was made collectively, but with the understanding that it might be their last choice. They made their way slowly back toward the entrance, the horses following reluctantly, their animal instincts warning them of continued danger above. The air grew gradually cooler and cleaner as they climbed, but also carried the acrid smell of destruction. They emerged into a landscape transformed beyond recognition. What had been green pastures and carefully tended buildings was now a blackened wasteland, studded with the skeletal remains of trees and structures. The ranch house was gone entirely, reduced to a pile of ash and twisted metal. The corrals were destroyed, though miraculously the spring still flowed, providing a small oasis of life in the devastation. But they were not alone. Father Santos waited by the spring with several Mexican vaqueros and a group of Apache warriors, their faces grim with the knowledge of what had been lost. The priest's expression lightened with relief as he saw them emerge from the mine shaft, but his eyes were hard with anger at the destruction surrounding them. "Gracias a Dios, you survived," he said, embracing both Hinto and Arabella with genuine emotion. "When we saw the fire and realized it had been set deliberately, we feared the worst." His voice carried the weight of a man who had seen too much injustice in his lifetime. "Sheriff Morrison is claiming this was a natural disaster, an unfortunate consequence of the drought, and the men who were positioned to prevent our escape?" Hinto asked grimly. Father Santos's expression grew darker. "Gone, of course. No evidence they were ever here, according to the official investigation." He gestured toward the devastation. "But this level of destruction, the pattern of burning, anyone with eyes can see this was no accident." As the full scope of their loss became clear in the growing daylight, Arabella felt a crushing weight of despair settle over her. Everything Hinto had worked for, the sanctuary he had built between worlds, the home where she had finally found peace, all of it was gone, reduced to ash and bitter memory. The men who had done this would face no consequences, would probably be celebrated for ridding the territory of another Indian problem. But as she watched Hinto survey the destruction with quiet dignity, as she saw the Apache and Mexican friends who had risked their own safety to search for survivors, as she felt Father Santos's unwavering support despite the danger it brought to his own position, Arabella realized that some things could not be destroyed by fire. The connections they had built, the love that had grown between them, the community of outcasts and idealists who valued justice over convenience, these were treasures that existed beyond the reach of hatred and fear. "What now?" she asked Hinto as they stood together in the ruins of his dreams. "Where do we go from here?" He looked at her with eyes that held both grief for what was lost and hope for what might yet be built. "We start over," he said simply. "We find new land, build a new home, create a new sanctuary for those who need one. His voice grew stronger with conviction. "They can burn our buildings, but they cannot burn our spirits unless we let them." As the sun rose over the blackened landscape, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed mockingly beautiful after such destruction, Arabella felt something shift deep in her chest. She was no longer the broken woman who had arrived seeking marriage as a means of social advancement. She was no longer even the defiant woman who had chosen justice over respectability in a courthouse confrontation. She had become someone forged in fire, tested by loss, and tempered by the kind of love that chose to rebuild rather than retreat. "Will you walk beside me?" Hinto asked, echoing the words that had begun their journey together, but giving them new meaning now. "Not behind me, not ahead of me, but beside me, as we build something new from the ashes of what was destroyed." His question was both proposal and promise. An invitation to create a life based on equality and mutual respect, rather than conventional roles and expectations. "Yes," Arabella said, the word carrying the weight of absolute commitment. "Yes, I will walk beside you wherever that path leads us." And as they stood hand in hand in the ruins of their old life, surrounded by friends who had proven their loyalty in the crucible of crisis, she knew that they had not lost everything after all. They had found something far more valuable than property or respectability. They had found each other, and the courage to build a love that could survive any fire. 2 months after the fire, Arabella stood in the largest courtroom Tucson had to offer. Her hands steady, despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. The territorial governor himself had finally ordered a federal investigation into the suspicious fire at Hinto's ranch. Prompted by a carefully orchestrated campaign led by Father Santos and supported by influential Mexican landowners who had grown tired of Morrison's increasingly brazen corruption. The courtroom was packed with spectators from across the territory. Apache families who had traveled days to witness this unprecedented moment when one of their own might actually receive justice from white man's law. Mexican vaqueros whose own ranches had suffered mysterious accidents after they'd traded with Hinto, and townspeople whose expressions ranged from supportive to openly hostile. Arabella wore her finest surviving dress, a deep blue silk that had somehow escaped the fire, and she had arranged her auburn hair in the severe style favored by Eastern intellectuals. Today, she was not trying to blend in or appear harmless. Today, she was weaponizing every aspect of her education and breeding to ensure that truth could not be dismissed as the testimony of an unsuitable woman. Federal Marshal James Whitmore, a weathered man in his 50s with steel-grey eyes that missed nothing, called the court to order. Unlike the local officials who had enabled Morrison's reign of terror, Whitmore had a reputation for impartiality that extended even to cases involving Native Americans. His presence alone had transformed this from a local whitewash into a genuine legal proceeding. This court is convened to investigate allegations of arson, conspiracy, and attempted murder in connection with the fire at the Hinto Ranch on August 15th of this year, Marshal Whitmore announced, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. The first witness will be Miss Arabella Hartwell, who was present during the incident in question. Arabella rose and walked to the witness stand with measured dignity, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes tracking her movement. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, working with Father Santos and a sympathetic lawyer from Phoenix to ensure that her testimony would be legally unassailable. Everything depended on her ability to present the facts with such clarity and conviction that even Morrison's allies could not dismiss them. "Miss Hartwell," Marshal Whitmore began, "please tell the court how you came to be present at the Hinto Ranch on the night of the fire." Arabella had anticipated this question and had her answer carefully prepared. "I was residing in a separate cabin on Mr. Hinto's property while serving as an English teacher to local Apache families and assisting with ranch correspondence. My presence there was entirely proper and served important community needs. A murmur ran through the courtroom at her confident assertion that her living arrangement had been proper. Morrison's supporters had expected her to be defensive about her unconventional situation, but instead she presented it as a natural extension of her educational background and charitable inclinations. On the evening of August 14th, did you observe anything unusual about the approaching fire? The marshal continued. Arabella nodded gravely. Yes, sir. The fire appeared to be advancing along multiple fronts simultaneously, which struck both Mr. Hinto and myself as highly unusual given the wind patterns that night. Natural fires typically follow predictable paths based on terrain and air currents. And what happened when you and Mr. Hinto attempted to evacuate the premises? Marshal Whitmore's questions were leading her systematically through the events, building a foundation for the more explosive testimony to come. We discovered that armed men had positioned themselves between the ranch and the town, effectively cutting off our normal escape route. We were forced to take refuge in an abandoned mine shaft to avoid being burned alive. Sheriff Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat at the defense table, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. The federal investigation had already uncovered enough evidence to bring formal charges, but Morrison's political connections ran deep, and his supporters were confident that a local jury would never convict a white sheriff on the testimony of an Apache and a fallen woman. Miss Hartwell, Morrison's lawyer said when he rose for cross-examination, isn't it true that you were living in an immoral relationship with the defendant Hinto, and that your testimony is motivated by personal attachment rather than concern for justice? The question was designed to destroy her credibility by attacking her character, the classic strategy for discrediting female witnesses. But Arabella had prepared for this attack as well. Sir, she replied with icy precision, I find it interesting that you assume any relationship between a man and woman must be immoral. Perhaps that says more about your own character than mine. My relationship with Mr. Hinto has been one of mutual respect and intellectual companionship, qualities that apparently seem so foreign to you that you cannot imagine them existing between people of different races. The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs at her counterattack. Instead of becoming defensive about her reputation, she had turned the question back on her interrogator, exposing the racist assumptions underlying his attack. Morrison's lawyer, clearly flustered by her unexpected response, pressed forward with increasing desperation. But surely you must admit that your association with Indians has colored your perception of events, he continued. How can this court trust the testimony of a woman who has abandoned the values of her own race? Arabella felt white-hot anger surge through her at the naked bigotry of the question, but she channeled that anger into devastating precision. The values of my race, as you put it, include a commitment to truth, justice, and protection of the innocent, she replied, with cutting clarity. If associating with people who share those values, regardless of their skin color, is somehow abandoning my race, then I am proud to be considered a traitor to your version of whiteness. Her words rang through the courtroom like a bell, and she saw several white spectators nodding in agreement. The prosecution's case built methodically through the morning, with expert testimony about burn patterns that proved the fire's artificial origins, statements from Apache witnesses who had seen the armed men positioning themselves around the ranch, and physical evidence of kerosene containers found near ignition points. But the most damning testimony came from an unexpected source. The prosecution calls Mrs. Helen Morrison, Marshal Whitmore announced, and gasps echoed through the courtroom as the sheriff's own wife rose from the gallery. Morrison's face went white as he watched his wife walk to the witness stand, her expression determined despite the obvious cost of what she was about to do. Mrs. Morrison, the prosecutor began gently, please tell the court what you observed on the evening of August 14th. The woman's voice shook slightly as she began to speak, but her words were clear and devastating. My husband came home that evening smelling of kerosene and alcohol. His clothes were covered in ash, and he was excited in a way I had never seen before. Did he say anything about the fire at the Hinto Ranch? She nodded, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. He said that the Indian problem in our territory was finally being solved. He said that decent white folks could sleep peacefully, knowing that savages and their white sympathizers were being taught proper lessons. Her voice broke on the last words. The courtroom was dead silent as the full implications of her testimony sank in. Morrison's own wife was testifying to his involvement in the attempted murder, providing the direct evidence that transformed the case from suspicious circumstances to proven guilt. Morrison himself sat frozen, staring at his wife with a mixture of betrayal and desperate fury. But Morrison's supporters were not finished. As Mrs. Morrison concluded her testimony and the court broke for lunch, tensions outside the courthouse reached a dangerous pitch. A crowd of Morrison's allies had gathered, their anger focused particularly on Arabella as the symbol of white betrayal of racial solidarity. Their shouts and threats made it clear that legal vindication might come at the cost of physical safety. "There she is!" someone shouted as Arabella emerged from the courthouse flanked by Father Santos and 2 federal deputies. "The white squaw who sold out her own people." The crowd pressed closer, their faces twisted with the kind of mob fury that had led to countless lynchings across the frontier. Arabella felt real fear for the first time since the fire. Hinto appeared beside her, his presence immediately escalating the tension. Several men in the crowd fingered their weapons, clearly hoping for an excuse to finish what the fire had started.
"Get your hands off her, you savage!"
one man screamed. "She may be a traitor, but she's still white." The contradiction in their anger, simultaneously condemning her for racial betrayal while claiming to protect her racial purity, would have been amusing if it weren't so dangerous. "That's enough!" Marshal Whitmore's voice cut through the chaos like a whip crack. Federal troops had appeared from seemingly nowhere, their rifles at the ready and their faces grim with purpose. "This court is under federal protection, and anyone who interferes with its proceedings will face charges of obstruction of justice. Disperse immediately or face arrest." The crowd reluctantly began to break up, but the threat remained palpable. As they made their way to Father Santos's rectory for safety, Arabella realized that winning the legal case might only be the beginning of their troubles. Morrison had powerful friends who would not easily accept his downfall, and those friends had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence against their enemies. That evening, as they huddled in the priest's study planning their next moves, a messenger arrived with news that changed everything. The territorial governor, under pressure from Washington politicians concerned about Indian relations, had ordered Morrison's immediate suspension pending the trial's outcome. More importantly, he'd appointed a new sheriff, Tom Bradley, Father Santos's nephew, a man known for his integrity and his belief in equal justice. "It's not enough," Hinto said quietly as they digested the news. "Even if Morrison is convicted, his supporters will continue to see us as symbols of everything they hate about the changing territory. We'll never be safe here, not really." Arabella felt her heart sink at the truth of his words. They had won the legal battle, but might still lose the larger war. "There is another way," Father Santos said thoughtfully, pulling out a letter he had received that morning. "I've been corresponding with church officials in California. They are establishing new missions among the Indian populations there, and they need educators who can work effectively with both native and white communities." He looked meaningfully at both Hinto and Arabella. "You're suggesting we leave?" Arabella asked, though part of her had already begun to consider the possibility. "Start over somewhere else where our past wouldn't follow us?" The priest nodded. "California is still frontier enough that people care more about what you can do than where you came from. And the church's protection would provide some shield against the kind of persecution you faced here." The conversation was interrupted by shouts from the street outside. Through the window, they could see flames flickering in the distance. Another fire, this one consuming the small school where Arabella had been teaching Apache children. The message was clear. Even with Morrison suspended, his supporters intended to continue their campaign of terror. Desecration. They're destroying everything, Arabella whispered, watching years of patient educational work disappear in flames. Every connection we've built, every bridge between communities, they're burning it all down. She turned to Hinto, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Maybe Father Santos is right. Maybe the only way to build the life we want is to start somewhere new. But before Hinto could respond, Tom Crow-Feather burst through the rectory door, his face painted for war and his rifle in his hands. Behind him came a dozen Apache warriors, their expressions grim with purpose. Tom spoke rapidly in Apache, his words carrying the rhythm of a war council rather than a friendly conversation. "What is he saying?" Arabella asked, though she could guess from the warrior's posture that violence was being planned. Hinto's face was grave as he translated. "He says the Apache bands have met in council. They have decided that Morrison's supporters must face consequences for their actions. They plan to attack the town tonight, to show that Apache people will not be terrorized without response." The prospect of open warfare between Apache bands and white settlers sent cold fear through Arabella's chest. Such a conflict would destroy any hope of peaceful coexistence and would certainly result in massive retaliation against innocent Apache families. "You have to stop them," she said urgently. "This will only make everything worse. They won't listen to me," Hinto replied grimly. "I'm seen as too compromised by white education, too willing to work within white systems. They respect me, but they don't trust my judgment about warfare." Tom spoke again, his words sharp with anger, and Hinto nodded reluctantly. "He says I can either join them or stand aside, but the attack will happen regardless." Arabella felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on them. Violence would destroy everything they had worked for, but continued passive resistance would only invite further attacks. The legal victory that had seemed so important that morning now felt hollow in the face of this new crisis. Justice in the courtroom meant nothing if it led to massacre in the streets. "There is a third option," she said suddenly, an idea forming with desperate clarity. "What if we could give them a victory without bloodshed? What if we could expose Morrison's corruption in a way that would satisfy Apache honor while avoiding open warfare?" Both Hinto and Tom looked at her skeptically, clearly doubting that any white solution could address Apache grievances. "I have Morrison's financial records," she continued, the plan crystallizing as she spoke. "Documents I rescued from the fire show years of embezzlement, illegal land deals, and kickbacks from traders who cheated Apache families. If we can present this evidence publicly, show that Morrison was stealing from everyone, regardless of race, it might unite the community against him instead of dividing it along racial lines." Father Santos leaned forward with interest. A public exposition of corruption might indeed be more effective than a legal trial. People who might ignore crimes against Indians would be outraged by theft from white settlers. Tom listened to Hinto's translation, his expression thoughtful. War was always uncertain, but destroying an enemy's reputation could be more devastating than destroying his body. The next morning brought news that vindicated Arabella's strategy. Marshal Whitmore, armed with the financial documents she provided, had arrested not just Morrison, but 3 of his key supporters on federal corruption charges. The evidence of systematic theft had indeed united the community. White settlers who had been Morrison's strongest supporters now demanded his head. Furious at being betrayed by the man they had trusted to protect their interests. More importantly, the Apache War Council had agreed to delay their attack, pending the outcome of the corruption investigation. Tom Crow-Feather himself had spoken in favor of Arabella's strategy, arguing that destroying Morrison's reputation was a more complete victory than simply killing him would have been. As they stood in the ashes of the burned school, watching work crews begin clearing the site for rebuilding, Arabella realized that their victory was more complete than she had dared hope. Morrison would face justice. His corrupt network was being dismantled, and the community was beginning to come together around shared principles rather than racial divisions. "Will you walk beside me?" Hinto asked again, but this time the question carried different weight. They were no longer refugees fleeing persecution, but partners in building something new from the ashes of the old. "To California, to a new mission, to a chance to continue the work we started here?" His eyes held hope tempered by realism. "Yes," Arabella replied, taking his hand as they looked toward the western horizon where their future waited. "Yes, I will walk beside you, wherever that path leads us." And as they stood together planning their new beginning, she knew that they had become something neither of them could have imagined when they first met, not just survivors of persecution, but architects of change, ready to build a world where love could transcend the artificial boundaries that others tried to impose. 3 years later, the California mission of San Miguel, nestled in a valley between golden hills dotted with ancient oak trees, its adobe walls warm in the afternoon sun. Arabella stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse she and Hinto had built together, watching their students, Apache Mexican and white children, work side by side on a geography lesson that spanned 3 languages and countless cultural perspectives. The transformation in their lives had been as dramatic as the landscape change from Arizona's red rocks to California's green valleys. Here, under the protection of progressive church officials and a territorial government more concerned with building than destroying, they had created something unprecedented, a true community school that served all races and celebrated all cultures. "Maestra Arabella," called out young Miguel Sandoval, a Mexican boy whose family had welcomed the unusual educational opportunity. "Why do the Apache words for directions include the colors of the 4 sacred mountains?" Arabella smiled at the question, remembering her own early struggles to understand cultural concepts that had no equivalent in her Eastern education. "That's an excellent question, Miguel. Perhaps Maria can help explain." She turned to Maria Crowfeather, Tom's granddaughter, who had become one of their most gifted students. The girl rose with quiet dignity, her voice clear as she explained the Apache understanding of geography as spiritual as well as physical reality. From across the room, 8-year-old Timothy Morrison, the sheriff's nephew, sent to live with relatives after his uncle's imprisonment, listened with fascination to concepts that would have been forbidden in his former home. The boy's presence in their school had initially caused tension, but Arabella and Hinto had insisted that children should not bear the sins of their families. The sound of approaching horses drew Arabella's attention to the window, where she saw a familiar figure dismounting with the easy grace she had come to love. Hinto had spent the morning at the regional land office, finalizing the purchase of additional acres that would allow them to expand both their school and the innovative farming cooperative he had established with local families. "Children," she announced, "I think class is finished for today. Please remember to practice your letter-writing assignments. And Maria, would you help Timothy with his Apache phrases?" The students gathered their materials with the casual efficiency of young people who had learned to navigate multiple languages and customs with equal ease. As the children dispersed to their various homes, some to Apache camps in the hills, others to Mexican ranches in the valley, a few to the growing white settlement around the mission, Arabella felt the deep satisfaction that came from work that mattered. Here they were building the future one young mind at a time. "How did the land negotiations go?" she asked Hinto as he approached, noting the expression of quiet triumph on his face. "Better than I dared hope," he replied, producing a rolled document from his saddlebag. "The territorial government has officially granted us title to the entire valley, with a special charter recognizing our school as a model for intercultural education." The significance of the achievement was enormous. In Arizona, they had been barely tolerated outsiders fighting for basic survival. Here, They had become respected community leaders whose innovative approaches to education and agriculture were drawing attention from as far away as Washington, D.C. "There's more," Hinto continued, his voice carrying a note of wonder. "Father Miguel received a letter from the territorial governor. They want to establish similar schools throughout California, using our model as the template. They're offering us oversight of the entire program." The magnitude of the opportunity made Arabella's breath catch. But before she could respond, the mission bell began ringing with the urgent pattern that signaled important news. Father Miguel Santos, who had followed them to California to continue his own work with diverse communities, appeared from the chapel with a telegram in his hands and an expression of barely contained excitement. "My friends," he called out as they hurried toward him, "this message just arrived from Washington. The Bureau of Indian Affairs has officially adopted your educational model for implementation at reservations across the Western Territories. They want you to train the teachers who will establish these programs." His voice carried the weight of historic significance. Arabella felt tears spring to her eyes at the realization of what this meant. The small experiment they had begun in defiance of hatred and prejudice was now being recognized at the highest levels of government. Their approach, treating all cultures as valuable, all children as worthy of respect, all communities as capable of growth, was becoming official policy. "There's something else," Father Miguel continued, his expression growing more personal. "The message specifically mentions that these programs will be established at locations where intercultural cooperation has proven successful. They want families like yours to lead the effort, to show that different peoples can not only coexist, but thrive together." The word families hung in the air between them, carrying implications that made Arabella's heart race. She and Hinto had lived as partners for 3 years, building a life together based on mutual respect and shared purpose. But they had never formalized their relationship through marriage. The legal and social obstacles had seemed too complex, the potential for additional persecution too great. "Arabella," Hinto said quietly, taking her hands in his as Father Miguel discreetly withdrew to give them privacy. "We have built something beautiful here, something that matters. But I want more than partnership in work. I want you as my wife, officially and completely, with all the legal protections and social recognition that brings." His voice carried the weight of years of restrained longing. "The obstacles," she began, but he gently interrupted, "have been largely removed by our success. California recognizes marriages between people of different races, especially when those people have demonstrated their value to the community. Father Miguel has already spoken with the territorial officials. There would be no legal impediment to our marriage." The proposal was everything she had learned to expect from Hinto: thoughtful, practical, but also deeply romantic in its recognition of what they had built together. "Yes," she said simply, the word carrying the weight of absolute commitment. "Yes, I want to be your wife, your partner in everything, your equal in building this new world we've envisioned." 1 month later, the valley filled with people who had traveled from across California and beyond to witness something unprecedented: the wedding of an Apache man and a white woman, celebrated not in secret, but as a community festival that honored both of their cultures while creating something entirely new. The ceremony itself reflected their unique approach to bridging differences. Father Miguel performed the Christian service in Spanish, English, and Apache, while Tom Crowfeather conducted traditional Apache blessing rituals that had been adapted to include the bride's Irish heritage. Mexican musicians played alongside Apache drummers, creating music that had never existed before but felt as natural as breathing. Arabella wore a dress of white silk decorated with traditional Apache beadwork, while Hinto dressed in formal American attire, enhanced with silver and turquoise jewelry, crafted by the finest Apache artisans. They were simultaneously honoring tradition and creating new traditions that reflected their blended identity. "Today," Father Miguel announced to the gathered crowd, "we witness not just the union of two people, but the birth of a new way of living together on this earth. Hinto and Arabella have shown us that love can transcend the artificial boundaries that divide us, and that families can be built on values rather than blood. His words carried the weight of religious authority used in service of progressive ideals. The celebration continued through the evening, with families from all three cultures sharing food, music, and stories in a harmony that would have seemed impossible in the Arizona of their early acquaintance. Children played games that blended traditions from multiple cultures, while adults discussed business partnerships and educational innovations that crossed racial lines. As the sun set behind the golden hills and the first stars appeared in the California sky, Arabella and Hinto stood together on the porch of their new home, a structure that combined Apache building techniques with Mexican architecture and American conveniences, creating something that belonged fully to no single tradition but honored them all. "Do you remember," Hinto asked softly, "when you first asked me why I was helping you? When I said it was because I knew what it felt like to be caught between worlds?" Arabella nodded, remembering that conversation in the Arizona desert that had started their journey together. "I understand now that we weren't caught between worlds at all. We were building a new world, one where being different wasn't a liability but a strength. And now?" she asked, leaning into his embrace as they watched their guests continue celebrating under the stars. "Now I understand that the space between worlds isn't empty. It's fertile ground where something entirely new can grow," he replied. "We didn't find a place where we belonged, we created one." The truth of his words resonated through Arabella's entire being. She was no longer the rejected Eastern bride who had been deemed unsuitable for conventional marriage. She was no longer even the defiant woman who had chosen justice over respectability. She had become something unprecedented, a pioneer of possibility, an architect of inclusion, a woman who had helped prove that love could indeed transcend every barrier that fear and prejudice tried to erect. 6 months later, as Arabella stood before a gathering of territorial officials and educational leaders, her pregnancy just beginning to show beneath her carefully tailored dress, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She was presenting their 3-year study on intercultural education to an audience that included the territorial governor, several federal officials, and representatives from tribes across the Western Territories. The key insight from our work, she explained to the attentive audience, is that diversity is not a problem to be managed, but a resource to be cultivated. When children from different cultures learn together, they don't lose their individual identities. They gain the ability to navigate multiple worlds and build bridges between communities. Her voice carried the authority of experience backed by documented success. In the audience, she could see Hinto listening with the same pride and support he had shown throughout their partnership. Beside him sat Tom Crow Feather, now officially appointed as liaison between the Apache bands and the territorial government, and Father Miguel, whose progressive approach to ministry had been endorsed by church authorities impressed with his community-building results. "The implications extend far beyond education," she continued, her confidence growing as she saw nods of agreement from even the most conservative officials. Communities that embrace diversity are more economically successful, more socially stable, and more capable of adapting to change. Our valley has become a model not just of tolerance, but of thriving multicultural cooperation. After her presentation, as officials crowded around to discuss implementation details and funding opportunities, Arabella felt a moment of quiet amazement at how far they had traveled from that dusty platform in Prescott, where she had first been rejected as unsuitable. That woman could never have imagined standing as a respected expert before territorial officials. Shaping policy that would affect thousands of lives, Mrs. Hinto called out the territorial governor, using the name she had legally adopted after their marriage. "I want to personally thank you for the remarkable work you and your husband have accomplished. You've proven that America's strength lies not in our uniformity, but in our ability to unite our differences in service of common goals. His words carried the weight of official recognition at the highest levels. That evening, as they sat together in their garden, watching the sunset paint the California hills in shades of gold and rose, Arabella felt her baby move for the first time. She placed Hinto's hand on her growing belly, marveling at the life they had created together. A child who would grow up in a world where love transcended racial boundaries, where different cultures were celebrated rather than merely tolerated. "What do you think our child will become?" she asked, imagining the possibilities that lay before a person born into their new world of inclusion and acceptance. "Whatever they choose," Hinto replied, his hand gentle on her belly. "They'll grow up knowing that their worth isn't determined by other people's narrow definitions of what's acceptable." As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, Arabella reflected on the words that had brought them together. "Will you walk beside me?" What had begun as a question born of loneliness had become the foundation of a life built on equality, respect, and the revolutionary idea that love could indeed create new realities. They had walked beside each other through fire and persecution, through triumph and transformation, proving that two people committed to justice and compassion could indeed build a better world. And now, as they prepared to welcome their child into that world, Arabella knew that their greatest adventure was just beginning. The cast-aside bride had become a pioneer of possibility. The lonely Apache had become a bridge between worlds, and together they had proven that love, when allied with courage and commitment to justice, could indeed overcome every barrier that hatred and fear tried to construct. In the golden light of the California sunset, surrounded by the community they had built and the family they were creating, they stood as living proof that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with rejection, because rejection can become the catalyst for building something far more magnificent than anything they could have found in the conventional world that had deemed them unsuitable. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.